What if someone told you they had feelings for you long before you even met? Diane Murphy, a retired librarian, found herself in just that situation when her neighbor's brother Thomas stepped into her life. Their connection blossomed quietly, weaving through shared stories and simple moments, until everything changed with a single, unexpected confession. Join us as we explore a tale of second chances, the beauty of companionship, and the mysteries of the heart. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more captivating stories. He told me he believed he had feelings for me even before we met. That's how he put it, just like that. No introduction, no hint, no time for me to prepare. And no, he wasn't some unknown person on a park bench or a sentimental man a couple of drinks into an afternoon glass of wine. He was my neighbor's brother. The one I'd only ever known through tales, brief glances, and the occasional wave from afar. And somehow his words altered everything. I suppose if I'm going to recount this tale, I should begin a bit earlier, before that instant, before the admission that still leaves my heart entwined in contemplation. My name is Diane Murphy, 61 years of age, recently retired from a lengthy, steady career at the county library, and residing in the same two-story colonial on Maplewood Lane, where I raised 2 sons and laid a husband to rest. Our street, nestled in a tranquil part of southern Indiana, doesn't see much activity. And that's just how I prefer it. My neighbor, Edna Winters, has been my companion for nearly 30 years. We've exchanged more cups of sugar, family anecdotes, and tears over fences than I can recall. She's the type of person who remembers everyone's birthday, keeps her rose bushes in flawless bloom, and still bakes banana bread on rainy days just because it feels right. Edna's brother, Thomas, was someone I'd only heard about through her stories. He lived out west somewhere in Colorado and only returned once every few years. Divorced, no children, and from what I understood, a bit restless in his spirit. When Edna mentioned he was coming to stay with her for a few weeks, I didn't think much of it. I assumed we'd exchange greetings and perhaps share a meal if Edna insisted. I wasn't seeking anything more than a serene spring, tending to my garden and catching up on my cross-stitch. But life, as it happens, has a way of planting seeds you didn't know were there. The first time I saw him in person, I was weeding along the edge of my driveway. He stepped out onto Edna's porch, carrying a folding chair and a steaming mug. The kind of calm presence you almost overlook unless you're paying attention. He caught my eye, smiled, and raised his cup like a silent greeting. I gave a quick wave back and returned to my task, brushing off the odd flutter that stirred in my chest. Over the next few days, we kept running into each other. Morning walks, trips to the mailbox. Once I caught him lingering outside my side gate, admiring the way the ivy had crept up my trellis over the years. He had that kind of easy warmth that made small talk feel like old conversation. We talked about the weather, sure, but also about favorite books, childhood memories, and what it felt like to grow older in a world that seemed in such a hurry. I learned that Thomas had been a high school history teacher before retiring early. He spent a few years drifting, camping across state lines, fixing up an old Airstream trailer, learning how to be alone. He'd recently sold the trailer and was, as he put it, trying to figure out the next chapter. I could relate more than I admitted aloud. One afternoon, Edna invited me over for lemonade on her back porch. She excused herself halfway through to take a call, leaving me and Thomas sitting with the fading sun casting long shadows across the floorboards. We talked about everything and nothing, and then he asked me about Jim, my husband. It had been 8 years since Jim passed. He had a quiet kind of love, the dependable, gentle kind that left you with space to grow. We met in college, married young, and stayed together through every bump and joy that came with building a life. Losing him had been like losing the foundation under my feet, and I'd spent the better part of the last decade learning how to stand on new ground. I told Thomas some of that. Not all, just the parts I could say without choking on them. He listened, really listened, the way people rarely do these days. And when Edna returned, the moment passed, tucked away, like a letter I wasn't sure I'd ever reread. The days blurred into a rhythm. We'd see each other in passing, sometimes stop to chat a little longer. One morning, he asked if I'd walk with him to the edge of the park trail nearby. It wasn't far, and I found myself saying yes, before I thought too hard about it. We walked slowly, side by side, the silence between us comfortable, like an old song you don't need to sing along with, to enjoy. He talked about Colorado, how the mountains had once made him feel small in the best kind of way. I told him about the library, the hundreds of stories I'd shelved over the years, and how some of them stayed with me like old friends. We stopped at a bench overlooking the creek, sat for a while, and watched the ducks paddle by. It was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. I didn't expect anything from him. I didn't even realize at first how much I looked forward to those little moments. Away from the porch, a brief exchange over the fence. But when he didn't come by for a few days, I felt the absence, like a light turned off in a room I'd grown used to. Then came the evening he knocked on my door. It was just past dinner. The sky streaked with purples and oranges, and I was still in my apron, drying dishes from a casserole I'd made too much of. He stood there, hands in his pockets, a quiet sort of determination in his voice. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked. I walked onto the porch, my heart beating a bit louder than I wanted to let on. He glanced around, as if ensuring no one else was close by, and then spoke. "I believe I had feelings for you even before we met." I blinked, searching for any hint of humor in his tone. A punchline, but there was none. Just the gentle sincerity of someone who had held something inside for too long and needed to express it. He mentioned he had heard about me for years, through Edna's tales, the pictures in her living room, the letters she occasionally shared. He said he used to wonder what kind of woman could earn such devotion from his sister. What kind of friend remained steadfast and through all circumstances? And when he met me, something just felt right. Not in a dramatic love-at-first-sight way, he quickly added, but in a sense that he wanted to get to know me better. He wasn't seeking anything specific, he said, just more moments like these, whatever they might be. I was at a loss for words. My hands were still wet from the dishcloth, and my heart was fluttering in a way I hadn't anticipated. So I gestured for him to come in for tea. We sat in the kitchen, steam rising from our cups, chatting about everything and nothing until the sun had completely set. Since that night, things have evolved, though not in the way one might assume. There were no bold declarations, no grand actions, just more time spent together, walks that lasted a bit longer, conversations that extended, and always a respectful acknowledgement of the boundaries we never crossed. It's fascinating, isn't it? How connections can develop like that, quietly, steadily, like ivy on a trellis, until one day you notice something beautiful has taken hold. But I'm jumping ahead. This isn't the conclusion of the story. Not even close. I never told Edna what her brother said to me that evening. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't seem like something that needed to be announced. It was private, intimate, like the rustling of leaves you only notice when everything else is still. Besides, I wasn't entirely sure how to interpret it myself. The next morning, I half expected things to feel altered, as if the air would buzz with some new energy. Or perhaps Thomas would avoid me out of awkwardness. But he didn't. Instead, he was on Edna's porch again, coffee in hand, giving me that same casual wave as I stepped out to get the newspaper. It was a small gesture, but it reassured me. We didn't discuss the previous night directly, but I could sense a change. Our conversations deepened. We talked about aspirations, not the kind you have while sleeping, but the ones that drive you forward. I told him how I once wanted to open a used bookstore with a small tea nook in the back. He smiled as if it made perfect sense. He said he had once thought about writing a novel, but never got past the first chapter. You could still write it, I said. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe spring turned into early summer, and the world began to blossom in that gentle way it does in Indiana. Suddenly, my garden came alive with color. The lilacs near the front porch attracted butterflies every morning. And my roses, those stubborn, temperamental things, finally decided to bless me with a decent bloom. Thomas started showing up just as I was finishing my morning chores. He brought coffee sometimes, or muffins he'd picked up from the farmer's market. Once, he handed me a folded piece of paper with a list of books he'd enjoyed over the years. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt personal, thoughtful, like he was offering me a piece of himself. One afternoon, I found him kneeling beside my bird bath, carefully adjusting the stones. He looked up sheepishly when he noticed me watching. "Hope you don't mind." I noticed the robins kept slipping on this edge. I laughed. They do have a flair for the dramatic. We stood there a while listening to the birdsong. He told me he used to sit in the backyard with his father, who could identify birds by their calls. I told him Jim used to do the same thing with our boys. That kind of nostalgia. The gentle kind. The kind that wraps around your memories like an old quilt, settled between us like a shared language. Some evenings, we'd take slow walks around the block. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the occasional dog barking or a distant lawnmower. We never held hands or walked too close. It wasn't like that, but sometimes our elbows would bump, and neither of us pulled away. It felt comfortable, not electric, familiar, not forbidden. We talked about our pasts more openly now. He told me about his marriage, how it started full of hope, but slowly became a thing held together more by habit than love. There was no betrayal, just a slow drifting apart. He said they parted kindly, which I found both rare and comforting. I shared more about Jim, how he loved crossword puzzles and had a laugh that could fill a room, how his passing had left me with a silence I didn't know how to live with at first. One evening, Thomas stopped me mid-story. "You know," he said, "Jim sounds like the kind of man I would have liked." I smiled, a little surprised by the warmth that filled my chest. "I think he would have liked you, too." I didn't know what to make of that moment. It felt like something tender had passed between us. Unspoken, but understood. A kind of acceptance, not just of the past, but of each other's presence in the here and now. We started a little tradition without planning it. Every Sunday evening, he'd come over with a book he'd picked from my shelves, and we'd each read a chapter aloud. Sometimes we'd talk about the characters. At times, we would meander into our personal tales. It was uncomplicated, yet it provided the week with a rhythm I hadn't realized was absent. Edna, always observant, began to remark on it. "You two have become inseparable," she mentioned one afternoon while we pruned her hydrangeas. I responded with a vague murmur. "He's pleasant to be around." She gazed at me, her eyes warm. "That's wonderful, Diane. You deserve pleasant company." It should have comforted me, but instead I felt a hint of concern. Was I entering something I wasn't prepared for? Was I occupying a void simply because it had been vacant for so long? And what if he departed again, as he always did? Those thoughts remained in the recesses of my mind, even as the days continued their serene progression. One day, we sat on my porch, observing a summer storm approach. The sky was a dense grey, hinting at thunder, and the air carried the scent of damp soil. We spoke little, merely observing the wind rustle the trees and listening to the initial drops of rain on the roof. "Do you ever feel remorse for desiring happiness again?" I inquired. Surprising myself, Thomas regarded me, his expression contemplative. "I did for a long time. I believe I convinced myself it was safer not to desire too much." I nodded. I understand that sentiment. He didn't attempt to resolve it or provide counsel. He simply remained with me in the silence, the way one does when someone shares something genuine. The following week he inquired if I would assist him in sorting through a box of old letters he had brought from Colorado. We sat at Edna's kitchen table, papers scattered between us like fragments of a puzzle. Some were postcards from acquaintances, others letters from his mother, now departed. One, dated nearly 3 decades prior, was from a pupil who had written to express gratitude for being the first adult to believe in him. "You preserved this all these years?" I questioned. He shrugged. It was significant. That evening, as I strolled back to my house, I pondered all the burdens we bear. Not merely the tangible ones, but the recollections, the aspirations, the sorrows we conceal in tranquil corners. And I wondered what it signified to share those things with someone once more. A few days later, I fell ill. Nothing grave, merely a summer cold that left me achy and fatigued. I lacked the vigor to rise from bed, much less tend to the garden or converse over the fence. I hadn't informed Thomas of my indisposition, but on the second day there was a gentle rap at my door. When I answered, he stood there holding a tray. Tea, toast, and a small vase with a solitary daisy. "I noticed your porch light remained off last night," he stated. "Thought you might be unwell." I was too weary to object. He placed the tray on the kitchen counter and sat nearby while I sipped slowly. We conversed little, but his presence filled the house in a manner that reminded me of its recent quietude. Before he departed, he remarked, "If you require anything, just call, even if it's merely to hear someone's voice." And I believed him. The next morning, I discovered a note tucked into my mailbox. It was brief, just a few linings. "Some individuals enter your life and rearrange the furnishings without inquiry. You entered and made it feel like home once more." No signature, but I knew its origin. Something within me softened after that. Not dissolved or collapsed, merely softened, like snow yielding to spring. I still didn't comprehend its entirety or its destination, but I knew I desired to continue advancing one step at a time with Thomas nearby. One evening, as we sat in the backyard observing the fireflies, I questioned him if he ever missed Colorado. "Occasionally," he replied, "but not in the manner I anticipated. It seems like a place I resided, not a place I belong." And here he surveyed our surroundings, then looked back at me. Here feels like a place I'm learning to remain. It wasn't a vow, it wasn't a scheme, but it was something. And sometimes something is sufficient to guide you to the next day. Thus, we persisted in our journey, continued our reading, kept savoring tea and heeding the birds, and allowing the days to unfold like pages in a cherished book. And every so often, I would reflect on that initial statement he made to me, that astonishing revelation on my porch. I think I loved you before I ever encountered you. And now, months later, I was beginning to grasp his meaning. But this wasn't the conclusion. Far from it. In truth, it was merely the commencement. Edna always asserted that July was when time truly began to extend its reach. The days feel lengthier because they are, she would jest, fanning herself on the porch, but also because our bones decelerate just enough to perceive it. I never heeded it much in prior years, but that summer I started to sense it as well. Not merely in my joints, but in the tranquil intervals between the hours. The spaces where Thomas's voice resonated after a visit, the pauses in our dialogues, no longer uneasy but contemplative, inhabited. By the first week of July, he was visiting nearly every morning, sometimes with fresh peaches or a paper bag of scones from the small bakery on Fifth, sometimes with nothing more than a tale he had been eager to share with me. He never overstayed his welcome, never demanded more than I could offer. But his presence integrated into my routine so effortlessly, it began to feel like a missing fragment had been restored. One Saturday morning, I invited him to accompany me to the flea market that assembles near the high school every summer. It's not extravagant, merely an assortment of white tents, collapsible tables, and sun-kissed merchants offering items ranging from artisanal soaps to antique war medals. I had visited most summers alone, typically acquiring a few trinkets for the home or a container of someone's grandmother's renowned strawberry preserve. However, this time, I considered it might be pleasant to have someone with me. He arrived donning a straw hat I hadn't previously seen, appearing more cheerful than stylish. Edna insisted I wear it, he mentioned, smiling. She said I'd crisp up like a cookie otherwise. We strolled the path leisurely, allowing the morning's tempo to guide us. I purchased an antique recipe book with yellowed sheets and scribbled annotations in the borders. He discovered an old compass, remarking it reminded him of the one his father used to have on their camping trips. We didn't converse much, but there was solace in the tranquil manner we occupied the space together. At one juncture, we halted at a stand displaying watercolor depictions of nearby barns and meadows. I observed Thomas scrutinize one of the artworks for an extended period. It depicted a straightforward scene, an aged red barn partially submerged in a hill of golden wheat, with a lone tire swing dangling from a close-by tree. It brings back memories of my uncle's farm in Kansas, he remarked. I spent a few summers there as a youngster. Learned how to milk a cow and how to fib about it when I didn't feel like it. I grinned. Sounds like a valuable learning experience. He glanced at me, his look inscrutable for a moment. It's curious how certain memories remain more vivid than others. Perhaps the significant ones know how to endure. He acquired the painting. On our journey back, we travelled in amiable silence. The windows were open, and the warm breeze carried the fragrance of freshly mown grass and a faint sweetness, perhaps honeysuckle. As we arrived at my driveway, Thomas reached into the back seat, retrieved the paper-wrapped painting, and handed it to me. I believe it should adorn your sunroom, he stated. I began to object. But he shook his head. You listened to that tale as if it held importance. That signifies something. Thus, it remained there, just above my reading chair, for the remainder of the summer. And each time I gazed at it, I recalled his voice narrating his Kansas memories, the quiet reverence in his tone. Around mid-July, Edna began experiencing issues with her knees again. It wasn't severe, just enough to keep her off her feet more than usual. Thomas started fetching her groceries, maintaining her lawn, and driving her to her medical appointments without grumbling. Observing him care for her so tenderly and without pause only intensified the quiet admiration that had been blossoming within me. One evening, after he had dropped her off at home and she had gone to rest, he arrived with 2 bowls of peach ice cream and that familiar uneven smile. She made me vow to sit down and relax. He said, "I'm adhering to instructions." We sat on the porch steps, savoring our treat slowly as the sun descended behind the trees. The crickets had initiated their nightly symphony, and a gentle breeze toyed with the edge of my sleeve. It was one of those instances that demands nothing of you but to acknowledge it. Have you ever contemplated what it signifies to begin anew? He inquired. I placed my spoon down, allowing the question to linger. I ponder it more than I confess. He nodded, then glanced at me askance. I used to believe starting over meant abandoning everything behind. Now I'm pondering if it merely means finding harmony with what transpired before. I lacked a witty response, but I reached for my glass of water, took a sip, and remarked, "Harmony is more challenging than people assume." The days persisted in their unhurried, meandering manner. We established a routine of observing the Sunday evening sunset from the back porch, books in hand, but seldom opened. He commenced assisting me with minor chores around the house, mending a creaky screen door, replacing a slanted step, bringing in sacks of mulch for the flower beds. One afternoon, as he fixed a broken drawer in my kitchen, he questioned if I had ever contemplated relocating. "Not really," I replied. "This house holds too many narratives. I don't believe I could transport them all elsewhere." He paused, screwdriver in hand. At times I envy that. I've relocated so frequently, I ceased labeling the boxes. I regarded him, realizing then how dissimilar our lives had been in that aspect. He was somewhat of a wanderer, never truly settling anywhere since his separation. And here I was, anchored in a dwelling filled with echoes. That night, I couldn't slumber. I kept reflecting on his query, on what it would entail if he remained, and perhaps more daunting, what it would signify if he departed. I was reluctant to acknowledge how much I had come to depend on his companionship, on the sound of his voice through the screen door. The little messages he left, one tucked into my gardening gloves, another beneath my teacup. Always simple but considerate. "You should cultivate more basil. Yours has a better aroma than Edna's. The sunlight looked particularly lovely on your porch this morning. Thank you for listening. Not everyone does." I commenced preserving them in a small container by my nightstand, not for any rationale I could articulate, just because they seemed worthy of keeping. Then arrived the day I didn't see him at all. No coffee, no knock, no message. I attempted not to make much of it, convincing myself he likely had tasks or required solitude. But when nightfall came, and my porch light illuminated without the familiar sound of his footsteps, I sensed a constriction in my chest. The following morning I ventured over to Edna's to inquire. She greeted me with her customary warmth, but her eyes bore a glimmer of worry. "He received a phone call last night. she disclosed. An old acquaintance from the western part of the country. He mentioned an opportunity and said he needed a couple of days to consider it. I attempted to nod as if it didn't catch me off guard, but it surprised me more than I cared to acknowledge. Once I was back home, I tended to my tomato plants and cleaned the porch, all the while trying to suppress the growing unease within me. I reminded myself that he was merely a visitor, just passing through as he always did, and that I knew better than to anticipate anything permanent. But expectations have a way of creeping in, even when we try to keep them at bay. He returned 2 days later, just as the sun was setting. I was on the porch, pretending to read when I heard his footsteps. He appeared weary, not exactly sad, but pensive, like someone who had been wandering in circles. "Do you mind if I take a seat?" he asked. I shifted to make space for him. He remained silent for a while, just sitting there, hands clasped, gazing at the horizon. Eventually, he spoke. "They've offered me a position with a non-profit that manages educational initiatives on native land in Arizona. It's only part-time, nothing major." I waited. I told them I'd consider it, but then I kept thinking about this porch, about our walks, about the way the morning light fills your sunroom. He looked at me then, and I began to wonder when I stopped seeking new experiences and started wishing for stability. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just wanted you to be aware. You've brought me more tranquility in these past few months than I've felt in years." My throat tightened. I nodded slowly. "You've provided me with quiet companionship I didn't realize I was missing." He smiled, a small, grateful expression. "Then perhaps we've both discovered something worth cherishing." That was all. No decisions, no plans, just two individuals sitting on a porch as the sky turned the hue of late summer. And while I was uncertain about what the next week would bring, I knew this much. The feeling wasn't going to disappear. Not yet, anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that was sufficient for the moment. August arrived leisurely, as if it had no option but to follow July's pace. The days grew heavy with heat, and everything seemed to move just a bit slower. The crickets were noisier at night, the breeze gentler, and the flowers in my garden sagged as if they'd grown weary from standing tall all summer. It was the kind of weather that made you want to sit with a glass of lemonade and do absolutely nothing. Thomas had stayed, not in any formal capacity. He hadn't signed a lease or moved in any belongings. But he no longer felt like a guest. He had become part of the routine now, part of my mornings, my walks, my quiet moments. His coffee mug had found a spot in my cupboard. His books were strewn on the sunroom table beside mine. It wasn't a grand announcement, just a gradual intertwining of one life with another. One morning, as we sat on my back porch, watching the birds peck at the feeder, he turned to me with a half smile. "Do you ever think about how unusual this all is?" I looked over at him. "What do you mean?" "This. Us. A history teacher and a retired librarian sitting on a porch in Indiana as if we've known each other forever." I smiled. "Unusual, perhaps, but not unwelcome." He nodded and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands behind his head. "I used to believe that connection had to be instant. Sparks, lightning, that sort of thing. But this feels more like a slow-burning fire. The kind you build and nurture, the kind that endures." I didn't respond, but I felt something shift within me. A quiet comprehension, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was still fastened. We didn't spend every moment together. That wasn't our way. But we did start to share more. Grocery trips, Sunday dinners, evenings where he'd read aloud while I sewed patches onto a quilt I'd been crafting for years. Sometimes we didn't converse at all, and those silences were full, not empty. I began to contemplate more and more what it meant to build a life with someone again. Not from the beginning, but from where we both were. We weren't young anymore. We carried our pasts with us, filled with joys and regrets, with memories too persistent to fade. But perhaps that's what made it function. Neither of us was attempting to rewrite our stories. We were simply adding a new chapter. Then one afternoon, Edna called. She rarely sounded anxious, but something in her voice alarmed me. "Can you come over?" she asked. "Something's amiss with Thomas." My heart leaped as I dropped the towel I'd been folding and hurried next door. He was sitting on the edge of the guest bed, pale, clutching his side. He looked up at me with an apologetic smile. "It's nothing, just a slight dizzy spell. Might have stood up too quickly." Edna looked unconvinced. So did I. After some gentle persuasion and a bit more firmness from Edna, we convinced him to let me drive him to urgent care. He grumbled, but didn't protest. The waiting room was quiet, and we sat side by side, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound for a while. "I'm fine," he said again. "Just a fluke." But when the nurse called him back, I saw the hesitation in his eyes. And when he was gone longer than expected, I felt the old fear return, the kind you think you've buried until it surfaces, uninvited. He came back with a small smile, a printout of test results, and a referral. Just some tests they want to conduct. There was no immediate urgency, yet it wasn't insignificant. I noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he neatly folded the paper. That same evening, after Edna had retired for the night and the sun had vanished behind the trees, he revealed the truth to me. A spot had been discovered on my lung. I remained silent, simply reaching across the table not to grasp his hand, but to push the sugar bowl towards him, a small gesture of solace. He mentioned he had smoked for a period in the past. Years back, he quit at 40, but you can never be sure. I nodded in understanding. What's next? More scans, a biopsy. They aimed to proceed swiftly. We remained silent for a moment. The cicadas hummed in the trees. A faraway dog barked. The night carried on, unaffected by the heaviness that had settled between us. "I don't wish to return to Colorado," he stated eventually. "Even if things take a turn for the worse, I want to remain here." I gazed at him. He wasn't fearful. Not in the manner some people are. He was composed, accepting, yet also resolute. "This place is home now," he added. "At least it feels that way." And in that instant, I realized I wanted to be the one who made it feel like home for him. The subsequent weeks merged into a series of appointments and waiting areas, into phone conversations and checkups, and lengthy drives to see the specialist in Evansville. I accompanied him to each one. He never requested it. I simply appeared, and he allowed me to stay. When the diagnosis arrived, early-stage lung cancer, treatable with surgery and follow-up care, he accepted it in his usual manner, quietly, with a calmness I admired. "I suppose I'm more fortunate than many," he remarked. "It could have been more severe." We spent the evening before his surgery on my porch. He desired nothing elaborate, just a simple meal, the sound of the breeze in the trees, and my presence. "I've never been adept at seeking assistance," he confessed. "Always believed I had to manage things alone. But I don't want to face this by myself. You won't have to, I assured him. He looked at me then, not with astonishment, but with thankfulness, as if he already knew. The surgery was successful. There were a few challenging days, and he disliked being pampered, but he recuperated more swiftly than anticipated. Edna, bless her, prepared soups and lifted his spirits with old tales and crossword puzzles. I was present every day, bringing tea, changing the bandages, sitting beside him as he slept. One evening, as we sat on the edge of his bed, observing the sunset through the window, he reached into the drawer and retrieved a small envelope. I intended to give this to you before the surgery, but I got nervous. I opened it. Inside was a message written in his tidy, slightly slanted script. I never believed I'd find someone again. Not truly, but you altered that. You reminded me of the feeling of belonging. I'm uncertain about the future, but if you'll have me, I'd like to continue sharing the days we have. I looked at him. My heart filled in a way I hadn't thought possible again. I want that too, I replied. And that was all. Not a proposal, not a grand proclamation. Just two individuals choosing to move forward together. We didn't hasten anything. There was no wedding, no moving date marked on a calendar. Just more shared meals, more quiet evenings, more chapters, read aloud in the sunroom. He began assisting me in planning the small bookstore I'd once mentioned. The one with the tea nook. We discovered a small space downtown, not much larger than a living room, with squeaky floors and dusty windows that allowed the most beautiful light to filter in. By October, we had shelves installed. By November, we had regular customers. Thomas managed the history section. I oversaw the fiction. We both worked the counter. Some days were hectic. Some days were slow, but every day felt like a gift. People often inquired if we were a couple. We never really responded. We just smiled, handed them their change, and returned to whatever story we'd been sharing. Winter arrived gently that year. Snow dusted the sidewalks like powdered sugar. The world decelerated, but our little store remained warm, filled with the aroma of tea and the sound of pages turning. One night, as we locked up and stepped out into the quiet street, Thomas looked at me and said, "You know, I still can't believe I found this. Found you." I took a deep breath, the cold air invigorating my lungs, and said, "I think we both found each other." He nodded, then gazed out at the snow-covered rooftops. "Let's continue building this, whatever it is." And we did, every day, with no need for anything more than what we already had. Love that demanded nothing but gave everything. And a quiet kind of happiness that never ceased to blossom.